Let's say you've chosen the design that is best suited for your project, whether that is an experiment, a survey, a case study, or something else. Now it's time to talk data. Data is the heart of research. When we say we're conducting research, all we're really doing is systematically collecting and analyzing data. What differentiates research from informed opinion is process. We aren't just gathering information to support an existing viewpoint from wherever we can find it. We've started with a problem or question that we want to solve or answer. We've read broadly about what scholars and experts have to say about it already, perhaps saving us the time from conducting our own study. We've developed hypotheses and theories, decided on variables, measured those variables, determined our populations and samples, and then chosen a research design that will let us investigate our subjects in a systematic way through observation, questions, or other forms of data gathering. And now we're ready to learn the next step in this systematic process, analyzing the data that we have gathered so that we can address the problem, puzzle, or question that prompted us to begin the process in the first place. Think of how different this process is from a haphazard gathering of facts. How many times have you been in a conversation and shared something you know, only for someone to say, "That's not true," based on a news story they'd heard somewhere? Or have you ever gotten into a battle on social media where people are flinging facts far and wide with no appreciation for the source of those facts or whether they've gathered them in a systematic way? The participants may insist that they've done their research, but research isn't reading whatever sources come up when you search for a term on your favorite search engine. We've talked about this before early in the course when we discussed the dangers of substituting your personal experience for research. We spent a lot of time learning about why random selection is so important to ensure external validity, the ability to generalize our results from our sample to our population. So why should we assume that our own experience, a decidedly non-random sample, would be representative of anything? It's human to do so, but decidedly non-scientific. My favorite example of all this comes from the television show The Office, the American version. If you don't know it, it was a fairly popular workplace comedy filmed in a mockumentary style that aired on NBC from 2005 to 2013. In season 3, episode 9, called The Convict, the boss, Michael Scott, discovers that one of his new employees formerly served time in prison for insider trading. The employee, Martin, tells his coworkers about his time in prison, noting that it wasn't so bad since the inmates had access to outdoor recreation time and classes. When the office workers comment that prison sounds better than work, Michael calls a meeting to convince everyone that there's no way that working in his office is worse than prison. He adopts the role of Prison Mike to explain to them what prison is really like, eating gruel sandwiches and having to deal with Dementors, which he assures them are not the Dementors from the Harry Potter novels. But when questioned on where his own knowledge of prison comes from, he admits that his source is the internet, and then, recalling the character he's playing, adds prison and asserts that it was 50-50 internet and prison. We're clearly not meant to take Prison Mike as an authority on prison life. His knowledge is clearly informed by media reports, films, and television, and brief internet research, hardly the systematic gathering of data. But we should also question whether Martin's experience is representative. His personal experience is more valuable than Prison Mike's, and the show paints Martin in a very positive and trustworthy light. But if we really wanted to know about life in prison, we'd be better off engaging in our research process, reading the literature and systematically gathering data, perhaps by interviewing or surveying many formerly incarcerated persons. That would tell us whether the experience of Martin, or by some strange happenstance, Prison Mike, were representative of a wider group. Today, let's start digging into the data we've systematically gathered ourselves. We're going to start by talking about the kind of data you may have gathered through your research designs, and then discuss how to organize, code, and otherwise prepare your data for analysis. We'll close by taking a look at some different tools we can use to help us process and analyze our data. Let's begin by taking stock of the data you've acquired by now. It likely comes in one of a few forms. You may have a mix or several or all of these forms of data, depending on your study. First, you might have data from an experiment. This will consist of the information you've drawn on your subjects and your variables of interest. For each subject, you'll know their value on the independent variable, whether or not they receive the treatment, and you'll have at least one set of measures for your dependent variable. If you conducted a post-test only study, you'll have whatever data you acquired for that post-test. This might be answers to an actual test, a survey, your observations of subject behavior, or however else you decided to measure the dependent variable. If you also conducted a pretest, you'll have double this information. You might instead have interview data. This data comes from directly interviewing your subjects as individuals or groups and recording their responses in video, audio, or by taking notes. These interviews might be completely unstructured, where you allow the person to tell their story however they want to, or it might instead be highly structured, where each person answers a set list of questions that doesn't alter regardless of their responses. And many interviews blend these two methods into a semi-structured format, where you have a list of questions or topics, but also ask follow-up questions based on the responses your subjects give you. Regardless of how you conduct your interview, you'll end up with notes or a transcript that can then be analyzed. Another kind of data is survey data. When you have your subjects fill out a questionnaire of some kind, we call that taking a survey. For each subject, you're going to get a number of responses on a set questionnaire. The close-ended responses can be input directly into a spreadsheet, while the open-ended responses might require either coding or qualitative analysis. While interviews tend to focus on a smaller number of subjects and don't always use random selection, surveys tend to aim for a larger number of responses gathered from a randomly selected set of respondents. Another form of data you might have is observational data. This comes from direct or indirect observation of your subjects. Generally, your data will be in the form of field notes from observing behaviors and events, but it can also include information from focus groups about their reactions to stimuli, such as facial expressions during a speech, watching a film, or some other kind of experience. If you've ever watched a presidential election debate on TV, you probably know about the focus groups that the major news networks run. They give each participant a dial that can register in real time the participant's reaction to each candidate, which can be a useful way of gauging debate performance. Our last broad category of data is the written record. Unlike the other forms of data we've discussed, the written record is typically not originally collected by the researcher and probably not for the purpose of scholarly research. Instead, this is often data found in documents, government and business records, statistical databases, news sources, videos and film, historical archives, and various primary sources. We may use this written record to create new data sets. For example, Professor Brett Ashley Leeds of Rice University and her colleagues produced a dataset called Alliance Treaty Obligations and Provisions, or ATOP. This is an extensive recording of the obligations and provisions of formal bilateral and multilateral international treaties between 1815 and 2016. This information can be downloaded into your favorite spreadsheet program, allowing you to quantitatively analyze the information there. But the origin of that data is the written record. Leeds and her team tracked down copies of these treaties from a variety of primary sources. They also used existing data sets and secondary sources in diplomatic history to ensure they didn't miss anything and to fill in information not found in the treaty language itself. As another example, content analysis uses the written record to produce large data sets. Content analysis is the systematic analysis of the written word, usually communication materials such as news articles, speeches, or other forms of written communication. Coders, humans or computers, can search these materials and identify themes, tones, word choice, people, and other items of interest, producing numerical counts of how frequently these items are found. Thus, the written record is again transformed into numbers that researchers can input into a spreadsheet. Regardless of its origins, your data will eventually be in one of two broad forms, quantitative or qualitative. As we've discussed, broadly speaking, quantitative data largely consists of numbers that lend themselves to statistical analysis. It's usually called large N, with N representing the number of cases. So Quantitative data consists of quantifiable information about a large number of cases. Qualitative data usually can't be put into numerical form so easily. It tends to be more descriptive or process-oriented, and therefore reducing it entirely to numbers would eliminate the richness of the data. It's sometimes called small n because the depth required for each case is large enough that it's not viable to collect data on a large number of cases. This isn't a clear-cut line, though. Qualitative research can use numbers, of course, and quantitative data regularly has non-numerical information in its spreadsheets. We will frequently assign numbers to data that don't have any meaning in and of themselves, just to allow us to analyze them. So please don't think that just because you have numbers in your data that this automatically means you have to conduct quantitative analysis, or that if your survey included qualitative responses, that statistical analysis is off the table. Let's think about the ATOP dataset we just discussed. The researchers took qualitative data, treaties, and expressed this in quantitative form. For example, they coded each treaty based on the type of alliance: a non-aggression pact, offensive pact, defensive pact, consultation pact, or neutrality agreement. This information can be entered into a spreadsheet. You could enter it in with words, so you could mark the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union as Non-Aggression Pact. But that's not how it appears in the dataset. Instead, the column called Non-Ag is littered with zeros and ones. 0 means it was not coded as a non-aggression pact, and 1 that it was. By using zeros and ones in place of words, we're much more able to analyze the data. So look at your data. Do your variables fall into clear values or categories that could be represented by numbers, if not already in numerical form? Do you have the same information on each case, the same variables, easily marked with their values? Do you have a lot of them? If so, your data is probably quantitative in nature. If not, if you have very few cases, if your data is largely descriptive or narrative, or if you can't clearly note the values that each variable falls on, or your data just doesn't lend itself to systematic numerical form, then you're probably working with qualitative data. 2 final caveats about your data before we move on. First, back up your data. I know someone who never finished a PhD because the person gave the raw survey data to a student research assistant to input, and that student ended up dropping out of college and moving away, with the data getting thrown in the trash. I know another student whose only copy of her thesis died with her computer when it fell in a canal on her walk to the library to submit it. These are not stories from the middle of the last century when it was understandable to only have a single hard copy of an important document. These are from the last 10 years. So back up your work regularly. Use a cloud service to ensure it backs up automatically, or save it to a flash drive or external hard drive, or email yourself regular copies. Better yet, do all of that. Every important document I have, including all my research, is backed up to 2 cloud systems and 2 external hard drives. I may be paranoid, but I've also never had to sheepishly admit to losing my work. Finally, keep in mind any IRB requirements for your data. If you have confidential data, you'll need to protect it. That means hard copies have to be in a locked location, such as a lockable file cabinet in your office. Digital copies need to be password protected. If your IRB requires you to destroy your hard data, you must do so after processing the data. For example, if you have audio or video recordings of subjects from which the subjects could be identified, your IRB may require you to destroy those recordings after you transcribe them. If not, you hang on to your raw data. It can be useful for replication and for your own reference. Okay, let's move on to preparing and coding data. Once we have our data, we have to start organizing, preparing, and coding it. For the most part, we're going to focus on quantitative data for the rest of this lecture. If your project focuses entirely on qualitative data, we'll talk about strategies for working with data in a later lecture. Generally, though, there's less data cleaning that needs to be done because you won't be running your data through a statistics program. Before you can analyze your quantitative data, you have to take the raw data and put it into a format that's usable. That usually means putting it into a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are incredibly useful. You probably use them in your daily life to do household budgeting or to keep track of an organization's membership. I'm partial to using color-coded spreadsheets for plenty of things: budgeting, grades for my classes, projects I'm working on, party planning, even character sheets in role-playing games. But they are also a cornerstone of large data sets. If you look at most data sets out there, such as ATOP, the General Social Survey, census data, and countless others, they're available in a spreadsheet-readable format. You can then analyze the data in the spreadsheet program itself, or for more advanced analysis, import the data into statistics software. Spreadsheets are also great because everything is already organized by columns and rows, with a single cell for each datum. Your cases go in the rows and your variables in the columns. You can have as few cases or variables as you like. It's also easy to run basic statistics in a spreadsheet program and to spot missing data before you run it through a more advanced program. It also allows you to pretty easily create new variables or cases. Let's say that you have the ATOP dataset but want to expand it back before 1815. You could follow their coding guidelines to code additional treaties and add that data to the existing spreadsheet file. Or perhaps there's something about those treaties from 1815 to 2016 that the research team didn't code but you think is worth studying. You simply add a new column and then, not so simply, go back through the hundreds of treaties and code your new variable. Or you might want to create a variable that combines two existing variables. Perhaps you would create a variable for alliances that combine both neutrality and non-aggression agreements, but nothing else. So you could compare those to alliances that promise offensive, defensive, or consultative aid. All of this is easy to add to a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet may not be necessary, though. For many studies, you can input the data directly into your analysis software, or a computer may be able to read and enter the data for you. If, for example, you conducted a survey through an online platform, the data will probably already be organized for you. Regardless of how you eventually get your data into a usable format, an essential part of the process is coding. Coding is the process of transforming your raw data for analysis. We'll discuss coding for qualitative work later in the course, but for now, let's discuss the process of getting your data ready for statistical analysis. Remember, quantitative analysis means that we're analyzing numbers, but lots of our data isn't necessarily in numerical form. If we were reviewing the data of Jane Elliott's eye color and discrimination study, which we discussed when learning about experiments, we have to somehow take eye color and turn that into numbers. Coding is how we do that. We determine the variable, in this case eye color, and give the variable a name. Typically the name should be short, in all capital letters, and an abbreviation of the full name of the variable. So eye color might become capital EYE for eye. We do this partly to keep the columns a uniform and narrow length. Then we code the variable by assigning numbers to all the values, perhaps 1 for blue and 2 for brown. We typically want a value for other in a category like this, but since everyone in Elliott's class had either blue or brown eyes, that's not necessary. When coding, you work with the data you actually have, not the data you could theoretically have. You might instead want to code two separate variables, one for blue eyes, perhaps IBL, and one for brown eyes, such as IBR. These would then be coded as 1 if the student had that eye color and 0 if not. We call these 0, 1, yes, no, it is or it isn't variables, dummy variables. Once you decide on the variables and how each response will be coded, you go ahead and code each respondent, entering the data into the spreadsheet or having assistants or a computer do this for you. You repeat this with all the other data you've gathered. Hopefully in your design, you were clear about the variables of interest so the coding is relatively straightforward. Now, as you code, you create a code book. At a minimum, this document explains your codes and what they mean. So when I look at the spreadsheet and see EYE, I don't necessarily know what Jane Elliott means by that. But if I look at the code book, I would see that EYE means the eye color of the subject, and that a 1 means blue and 2 means brown. At their best, code books explain the complete process on how the researcher gathered and coded the data. If you review the code book for the ATOP dataset, for example, Leeds and her colleagues explain who was involved in the project, how they defined their terms, how they identified their cases, the sources of their data, the questions that guided the data collection for each treaty, and the specifics of each variable. One final note on coding. You want to make sure that the coding is done consistently and accurately. We have terms for that: reliability and validity. Remember those? They always sneak back into our discussions. Reliability, you'll recall, has to do with consistency. We discussed it in our section on measurement, and we said then we want our measures to be able to be consistently employed. This is also true when coding. Coding is about taking raw data and transforming it into usable categories. We need to make sure that no matter who is doing the coding or when, that it's consistent. Sometimes we get help with our data entry, meaning that multiple people are using and interpreting our codebook. Ensuring reliability becomes particularly important. In other words, if you code the data and I code it, and our coding is inconsistent, we have a reliability problem. And we know that if you don't have reliability, you don't have validity, which undoes all the good work you've done so far. There are a couple of ways to achieve what we call inter-rater reliability, the kind of reliability that ensures that multiple coders are applying the same measures consistently. One way is to have more than one person code the same sample of data. You can then check to make sure they're on the same page and coding consistently with each other. They can do this either on a sample to check their work, or you can have more than one person code the entire data set and then check for discrepancies. Sometimes it's not possible for one person to do all the scoring or coding needed by your project. In such cases, you'll need to employ extensive training of the raters to ensure they know how to apply the coding system. An example of an inter-rater reliability challenge comes from the annual scoring of advanced placement exams. Every spring, millions of high school students across the United States take these exams to try to earn college credit for advanced classes taken in high school. These exams usually consist of multiple choice questions easily scored by Scantron machines. The only reliability problems there are when a student fails to fully fill in their little oval with a number 2 pencil or leaves erasure marks. Otherwise, the Scantron system is highly reliable. The trouble is with the free response questions. Those can't be scored by a computer, so the Educational Testing Service, or ETS, hires thousands of high school and college teachers with expertise in the subject to individually read and score every single essay. This traditionally takes place over the course of a week. For 7 days, from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m., teachers read responses to the same essay question over and over, applying a rubric to determine the proper score for each essay. The key here is to make sure that no matter which teacher scores the essay or when they do it, at 8 a.m. on day 2 or 4:55 p.m. on day 7, that the student's response is given the correct score. That's a reliability problem. How do they make sure the rubric is consistently applied regardless of who rates it or when? ETS staffers use a few methods. First, they spend the entire first day training the scorers on the rubric using a variety of methods. They select a sample of student essays, and the training team scores them and agrees on the correct score. Then the army of readers scores the same set of essays and reviews why it earns a certain score. The second method is called back reading. Each table of readers has a table leader. Their job for at least the first few days is solely to back check the work of their readers. They randomly choose and read about 15% of each reader's work, making sure they agree with the score and discussing any inconsistencies. Finally, every reader's scores are tracked and compared to the average score for the question. If any reader's scores are consistently higher or lower than the average, one of the leaders will approach them to discuss their application of the rubric. To say that ETS takes reliability seriously is putting it mildly. I'm not saying you need to do all of these things in your own project, but you do need to think about the reliability of your measures and coding, and this is a good example of how that can be done on a massive scale when a lot is at stake. Okay, so you've coded your data and set up your codebook. There's one more step before you can dig into the analysis. We have to deal with missing data. Missing data is a part of research. Sometimes someone skipped a question on your survey, or you just couldn't get an answer on the case you studied. If you recall the Good Samaritan study we looked at earlier in the course, you may remember that we didn't know for sure if the authors used a random sample. They simply didn't say how they selected their sample. If I was doing a study on the most common types of sampling found in experiments from the 1970s, I'd have to mark that cell as missing. Do your best to get a complete data set, but recognize that it's rarely possible. The only real problem is if so much data is missing that you don't have enough to analyze, or if there's something systematic about the missing data. If everyone in your study left a particular question blank, for example, that might tell you more about your question than your study. When you have missing data, you need to mark it as missing. You can leave the cells empty, but sometimes it's better to mark it with a number, such as 9, 99, or -1. Stats programs can be told what the value is for missing data and deal with it accordingly. All right, we're finally ready to start seeing what our data has to tell us about our hypotheses and questions. The only question that remains is, how are you going to do it? You can't eyeball quantitative data. You need to use a data analysis program capable of doing the kind of analysis you need. There are dozens, if not hundreds, to choose from. Some are free, others are quite expensive. Some are rather simple, others highly complex. My general advice is to go only as complex as needed to answer your question. Highly complex statistics don't necessarily give you better answers than the easier, more basic calculations. For many of your projects, you'll find that the basic analyses we'll learn about in the next lesson, combined with visually appealing tables and charts, are sufficient to answer your question and communicate your findings. Don't put in the work to learn a more advanced package unless you need to. Also, don't be afraid to find a mentor or collaborator. Even if you do get training in a particular package, it may be that on your next project, a different tool or set of analyses that you don't know would be better. You may find it easier and get better results from consulting with a stats expert. That being said, let's take a quick look at some programs that are out there. For most of the statistical calculations we'll use in this course, you really only need a solid spreadsheet program. There are free ones available for general use, and it's relatively simple to do these kinds of calculations. That's what we'll use at our next lecture. Of course, more advanced programs can also do those calculations, generally with a push of a single button. The reason I advocate for spreadsheet programs is that they're widely available on most computers and useful for many other tasks besides stats. So learning how to use them in this capacity is a great skill to have. If you need to do more higher level analyses, then you'll need something more specialized. One commonly used tool for data analysis is SPSS, which stands for Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. While not free, it is very user-friendly with pull-down menus that make it easy to choose and run the calculations you need. It's widely used not only in the social sciences, but also by researchers working in fields such as health, education, marketing, and survey research. R has become a fairly popular data analysis package, and it has two strong advantages over SPSS. It's free, and it's capable of the highest level of analysis. But there's a drawback. You have to learn how to code in R in order to use it. That can require a large investment of your time to learn if you don't already have strong programming skills. If you're willing to put in the time, R is probably the best stats package out there, capable of pretty much any analysis you need. But if your project doesn't require work at such a high level, you may want to consider other options out there. There are, as I mentioned, dozens of other options out there. 3 others are Stata, widely used in the social sciences, JMP, a package common in engineering, or SAS for finance and manufacturing, amongst others. There are 3 main considerations when you're choosing your package. First, availability. Some of these programs are free and others require licenses. If you have ready access to one already, it may be worth focusing on that. Second, consider your field. Some stats packages are widely used in some disciplines and not in others. You may find it useful to use the ones commonly used in your area of research. At the very least, the manuals and guides you find will be more geared towards your work, and you'll face fewer questions on your choice when you share your research with your peers. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Choose your stats package based on the data you have and the tests you need to run. If you just need to run lower level calculations, a spreadsheet program will work just fine. SPSS, being very user-friendly, is also a strong choice. On the other hand, if you end up needing to run more high-level analyses, you will want to learn R or another more advanced package. I think that's enough preamble and preparation. Let's start to dig into data analysis, shall we? Join me in the next lecture, where we learn how to calculate basic descriptive statistics.